Today your assignment is to read Death in New Jersey and fill out the worksheet. The events that are described in this article are supposedly the events that inspired the awesome movie Jaws. Now, I also attached the Jaws death scene clip to Google Classroom for your enjoyment. If we were in class, we would have had so much fun watching the death scene together. But we're not. So you have an option. You can just read Death in New Jersey on your own and fill out the worksheet, or you can follow along, listen to me read, and I will go over every answer to Death in New Jersey with you in this video. Your choice. Before we start reading the article, a smart thing to do as a student is to always look at what questions you need to answer. So we're going to look at what the mayor did to assure the people about no more shark attacks, and we're going to see why this was unusual for a shark to be in Matawan Creek. We're going to look at 12-year-old Lester and how he suffered from fits. What was Stanley Fisher doing when he was attacked? How did the townspeople react to the deaths? What did Dr. Nichols give for the shark? What reason did Dr. Nichols give for the shark attacks? And then finally, we are going to be looking at each victim and filling out a chart. So every time we get to a victim's name, we need to go back to this chart and fill it out with the date of their attack, the city it happened in, and finally their injury is supposed to be in that last box here. So if they died, that's the injury, death. So let's get started with the article. In 1916, in the middle of World War I, an extraordinary series of shark attacks in the United States of America left 3 men and 1 boy dead, with the second boy badly injured, in the space of just 12 days. The sleepy towns on the New Jersey coast, just north of New York or just south of New York, were suddenly the focus of national interest. These events inspired the movie Jaws. The panic came slowly. On July 1st, 1916, a 25-year-old Philadelphia fine arts graduate, Charles E. Vansant, was swimming 15 meters from the shore at Beach Haven, New Jersey, when people on the beach saw black fins slicing toward him and shouted at him to get out. Vansant splashed madly for the beach. As the shark closed on him, he screamed for help and then went under. An Olympic swimmer on the beach dashed into the water and pulled the badly mauled Vansant to shore. He died in the hospital the following night. So we have our first victim, Charles Vansant. The date of his shark attack was on July 1st in the city of Beach Haven, and the result of his injury was death. The tragedy stirred no great unease along the Jersey shore, and still less in Manhattan, where the editors of the New York Times placed a 2-paragraph report of the shark attack on page 18. It was one of the minor tragedies of summer, like a swimmer hit by lightning. 5 days later, the level of anxiety on the Jersey shore made a quantum leap upwards. On July 6, Charles Bruder, a bellboy at the Spring Lake Hotel, was attacked while swimming beyond the lifelines. A woman on the shore cried that she saw a red canoe beneath the waves, but the canoe was pumping from Bruder's severed legs. He died on the beach. Lifeguards and old Spring Lake residents told a New York Times reporter that this was the only shark attack death at the resort that they could remember. The Times editors placed the story with the details of women fainting and panicking on page 1. Spring Lake Hotel staff raised $1,000 to send to Bruder's mother in Switzerland. So now we need to go back to our chart and fill it out for Charles Bruder. The date of his shark attack was 5 days later on July 6th, and it was in the city of Spring Lake. And again, his injury, poor guy, was death. Although Bruder's death kept swimmers close to shore at Spring Lake the next day, even this elementary precaution extended no more than a few kilometers away. But the businessmen of local resort towns, naturally assuming that news of shark attacks would not help to attract summer holiday makers, wanted reassuring official action, and Spring Lake Mayor Oliver H. Brown immediately established a motorboat patrol. The boats dragged bleeding quarters of lamb as bait, while marksmen with rifles stood ready to shoot should a fin materialize. None did. The mayor also ordered the beach bathing area enclosed in a shark-proof wire net. a precaution also taken by the nearby resort of Asbury Park. So now we know the answer to question 1 about what the mayor did to reassure people no more shark attacks would occur. 1. He set up a motorboat patrol with marksmen that would shoot sharks when they saw them. Another thing that the mayor did was put a wire shark net around the beach area. I would feel better, wouldn't you? Fishermen and surfers ridiculed these precautions, pointing out that no shark had ever been sighted off Asbury Park. Academic experts were also reassuring. Dr. Nichols, the American Museum of Natural History shark expert, said there was more chance of being struck by lightning than being attacked by a shark, and in any case, sharks' jaws were not powerful enough to bite through a human leg bone. The captain of a transatlantic liner said he was astounded to learn of a man-eating shark off the New Jersey coast. This was the first time he had heard of one north of the Bahamas. A report in the New York Times on July 11th said, "Tiger sharks will hold but little terror for bathers in the waters hereabouts within the next few days because of the netting at Asbury Park." It was a classic piece of predictive journalism. Within 24 hours, sharks were part of every conversation on the Jersey Shore. July 12th brought tropical heat and humidity to Matawan, New Jersey, a small town 17 kilometers west of the Atlantic shore, linked to the ocean by a meandering tidal creek. At 2 p.m., Lester Stillwell, a 12-year-old boy employed at the town's sawmill, was given the afternoon off because of the stifling heat. With 4 friends, he headed for Wyckoff Dock, a dilapidated old steamboat pier on Matawan Creek, which was the town's most popular swimming hole. Throughout the summer, boys would liberate themselves from the heat and boredom by playing on the exposed dock pilings. Shortly before Lester and his friends headed for the creek, Captain Thomas Cottrell, a retired sailor, was walking across a new Matawan Creek bridge, about 750 meters downstream from the swimming hole. He saw, beneath the sparkling creek surface, a huge black shadow moving quickly upstream with the incoming tide. Cottrell did not stop to tell himself that no shark could be that far upstream. He ran for a telephone and called the town's barber, John Molson, who was also the chief of police. Then he ran to Main Street, telling groups of boys headed for the creek, merchants and their customers, "There's a shark in the creek." People thought he was crazy. A shark? In a creek 10 meters across at its widest? Clam diggers worked the shallow at low tide. Poor old Tom's eyes must have been playing tricks on him. As Chief Molson stopped his razor, he reflected that people tell policemen some crazy stories. Lester Stillwell, who suffered from fits, was a strong swimmer. He was floating further away from the pier than his friends when they saw him suddenly disappear, re-emerge, scream, then disappear in a flurry. His friends sprinted into Matawan, shouting that Lester had a fit in the creek and had disappeared in the water. And normally this is a question I definitely answer with the class, number 3. Lester was said to suffer from fits, and what do you suppose this means? Well, fits in this instance is an old-fashioned term for seizures. So the boys thought he might be having a seizure. The other question we're going to answer is number 2. Why was it unusual for a shark to be in Matawan Creek? Well, the word creek should give it away. 1, creek, it's a freshwater body. And number 2, it was not very big, only 10 meters across. So that's a really small width for a shark to be swimming through. Stanley Fisher, a likable, popular man of 24, who had just started a dry cleaning business, was one of the many who heard the boys' shouts. Fisher, a 210-pound blond giant, had recently been mocked by his friends for accepting a $10,000 life insurance policy instead of cash in a payment for a lawsuit. He was nuts, they said. "You? Life insurance? At 24? You must be joking." The good-natured Fisher just smiled quietly. As Fisher ran for the creek, he passed a woman acquaintance, a Matawan teacher, who shouted, "Remember what Captain Cottrell said. It may have been a shark." Fisher barely paused. "A shark here?" he said. "I don't care. I'm going after that boy." Men, women, and children were streaming from the town to the pier, among them Lester Stillwell's parents. As Fisher yanked on his bathing trunks and plunged into the creek, About 200 people lined the banks, while men in rowing boats pulled for Stillwell's body. The urgency of action, the need to do something, anything, in the face of tragedy, must have driven Fisher, for in his rational mind he surely knew that if Lester was still beneath the creek he must have drowned, or worse. But the urgency of the moment was very powerful. Several other men were also in the creek, making repeated dives, clawing along the mud for the boy's body. After several midstream dives, Fisher surfaced and shouted to the watchers on the bank, "I've got it!" He had a grip on Lester's body and struck out for the nearer shore opposite the pier, followed by 2 men in a motorboat. He stood up in waist-deep water near the bank, then staggered, cried out, and dropped into a crouch. From the motorboat, Detective Arthur Van Buskirk saw Fisher with both hands clamped around his right leg. The outside of his thigh, from his hip to his knee, was missing. Van Buskirk pulled him onto the boat. On the dock, men improvised a stretcher from planks and carried him, still conscious, 250 meters to the Matawan Railroad. He was placed aboard the train from Long Branch. At 7:45, he was being wheeled into the operating room of the Monmouth Memorial Hospital. He died. The townspeople, frightened and angered by the monster which had killed a boy just on the verge of leaving childhood and one of Matawan's most personable young men, in one unbelievable afternoon of horror, collected dynamite and set underwater charges by the pier. They had 2 hopes. The blast might kill the shark, and they might force Stillwell's body to the surface. So we're going to go back and pick up Lester Stillwell and Stanley Fisher. The date of their attacks were July 12th in the city of Matawan, and their injuries, both death. Just as the charges were ready for blasting, a motorboat roared upstream to the pier with another shark victim. Joseph Dunn, a 14-year-old from Upper Manhattan, had been swimming with several other boys off a dock 800 meters downstream from the Wyckoff Pier when someone ran up with a warning. "There's been 2 shark attacks upstream. Get out of the water!" The boys struck out quickly for the dock. Joseph, the last out, was on a ladder when the shark seized his right leg. "I felt my leg going down the shark's throat. I thought it would swallow me," he said. At first Dunn would not give his name because he was afraid his mother would worry about him. Seriously injured, with much of the flesh below the knee stripped from his leg, he was rushed to St. Peter's Hospital in New Brunswick. So now we have Joseph Dunn. The date the same, July 12th, in the city of Manhattan or New Brunswick, either one, and the injury, leg bitten. While a surgeon cleaned and stitched Joseph's severed tendons and lacerated leg muscles, Matawan Creek boiled and spurted geysers as if a primal force had been let loose between its tranquil banks, as indeed it had. In the grip of anger, fueled by fear, the men of Matawan purchased all the town's dynamite in a few hours. Before the sun set, the town was also out of ammunition. Hundreds of men lined the creek banks armed with handguns, rifles, and shotguns. Those without guns brought pitchforks, knives, boat hooks, antique harpoons ripped from the living room walls, even hammers. A small army of newspaper reporters and photographers descended on the creek, while newsreel cameramen filmed the vengeful fury and sometimes added to it, especially as large charges pushed white geysers high above the creek for the benefit of the newsreels. Shark sightings and sightings of shadows were as common as the claim in the low-tide ooze, especially by lantern light. With the incoming tide, sightings abounded. With the outgoing tide, escaping sharks abounded. A chicken wire net was strung across the creek just above Wyckoff Dock, and a strong fish net across the bridge where Captain Cottrell sighted the Black Shadow. But 2 days after the tragedy, the orgy of vengeance had yielded nothing, and Lester Stillwell's body had not been recovered. While the men who sought relief in action shot and dynamited the creek, others, who sought the relief of understanding, tried to answer the questions. What sort of shark was it? And why these unprecedented attacks at this time? Dr. Nichols believed a single shark was responsible for all the attacks. He thought it was a great white, or tiger shark, which had got out of the Gulf Stream, could no longer find the green turtles which were its staple diet, and had developed a taste for human flesh after the attack on Charles Vansant. Some local fishermen blamed the Germans. World War I had reduced the number of passenger ships entering New York harbor, which tossed refuse overboard, so the sharks were naturally looking for an alternative food source. Although the New York Times loftily opined from the safety of its office on West 43rd Street in Manhattan that sharks have a much better right to kill us than we have to kill them, dozens of sharks were being hooked, shot, and dynamited. On April 14th, funeral services for Lester Stillwell, whose body had not been recovered, and Stanley Fisher were conducted in Matawan. The same day, a Manhattan taxidermist who had caught a 2.4-meter shark off New Jersey exhibited 2 bones found in its stomach, one of them identified by physicians as a boy's shin bone. Joseph Dunn survived. 59 days after the attack, he left St. Peter's Hospital. His leg would always bear the purple scars, but he was able to walk away. Lester Stillwell's body was eventually found 100 meters upstream from the Wyckoff docks 3 months after the attack. It was marked by 7 bites. On the same day, President Woodrow Wilson's cabinet met in Washington and devoted much of the agenda to the shark menace. The Treasury Secretary promised to instruct the Coast Guard to use every means for driving the sharks away or killing them, although he acknowledged that the Coast Guard really couldn't do too much about man-eating sharks anyway. The director of the Museum of Natural History, Dr. Lucas, offered newspaper reporters the insight that the reason of the shark attacks was that 1916 is a shark year, just as we have butterfly years and armyworm years. 3 days after Lester Stillwell's body was found, the mayors of 10 New Jersey coastal resorts issued a statement protesting about the news reports, which caused the public to believe the New Jersey seacoast is infested with sharks, whereas there are no more than any other summer. There was a lot of conjecture, both at the time and later, about which species of shark was responsible for the attacks at Matawan. Experts at the Museum of Natural History in New York thought that either a great white or tiger shark was to blame. Indeed, a 2.6-meter great white shark was caught in Raritan Bay 2 days after the attacks at Matawan, with human flesh and bones in its stomach. Clearly, it had eaten parts of at least one person, but whether it was Charles Vansant, Charles Bruder, Lester Stillwell, or Stanley Fisher could not be determined. When the wounds on Stanley Fisher's legs were examined and measured, it was found that the distance between the teeth on opposite sides of the shark's jaws was about 35.6 centimeters. Comparisons seemed to indicate that a shark with the jaws that size was probably longer than the 2.7-meter specimen that witnesses reported seeing in the creek. The puzzle is that great white and tiger sharks rarely venture into fresh water. The one shark that is commonly found in fresh water, however, is the bull shark. As a final side note, Stanley Fisher was one of very few people to have been injured while going to the aid of a shark attack victim. Number 4, what was Stanley Fisher doing when he was attacked? He was helping someone, and that is very unusual. That rarely happens. Number 5, how did the townspeople react to the 2 deaths? Shooting up sharks, dynamite, kind of going crazy. And finally, number 6, what reason did Dr. Nichols give for the shark attacks? Well, the sharks developed a taste for humans after it ate Mr. Vansant, or they were looking for an alternative food source after the New York harbors were dirtied. So now, go watch that Jaws video. Bye, kids.